What would you do if you came home to find your family throwing your belongings into the street while changing the locks on your house? Would you call the police? Would you beg them to reconsider? Would you quietly find somewhere else to live? Well, when I discovered my son and his wife had literally thrown me out of my own home, I didn't do any of those things. Instead, I made a phone call that would turn their eviction into their own nightmare. The first thing I noticed when I turned onto Maple Street that Tuesday afternoon was the moving truck parked in my driveway. It was one of those big yellow trucks that people rent when they're relocating their entire lives, and seeing it there sent an immediate chill of panic through my chest. I'd been visiting my sister Margaret in the next town over for 3 days, helping her recover from hip surgery, and I certainly hadn't arranged for any moving services. As I drove closer to the house I'd called home for 37 years, the scene that unfolded before me was like something out of a nightmare. My belongings, furniture, clothing, personal items, everything I owned, were being systematically loaded into the truck by 3 men in work uniforms. Standing on the front porch, directing the operation like she was orchestrating a military campaign, was my daughter-in-law Rachel. I parked across the street and sat in my car for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. This had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe Rachel was helping me with some kind of surprise home renovation. Maybe she was moving things to storage while contractors worked on the house. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for why my entire life was being packed into a moving truck without my knowledge or consent. But then I saw my son Michael emerge from the house, carrying my mother's cedar chest, the one that contained my wedding dress, my baby clothes, 40 years of photographs, and every love letter my husband Robert had ever written me. He tossed it into the truck like it was worthless junk, and I watched through my windshield as he laughed at something Rachel said. They were laughing. My son and his wife were laughing while strangers hauled away my most precious possessions. I got out of my car and walked across the street, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "Michael," I called out, my voice steady despite the chaos of emotions flooding through me. "What's going on here? Why are my things being moved?" Michael turned around, and the expression on his face wasn't surprise or embarrassment or even guilt. It was annoyance, like I was an unwelcome interruption to his busy day. "Mom," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, "we need to talk. Rachel and I have made some decisions about the living situation here." The living situation. He was talking about my home like it was a business arrangement that could be terminated at will. "What kind of decisions?" I asked, though the evidence was literally being loaded into a truck right in front of me. Rachel stepped down from the porch and joined us in the driveway, her arms crossed and her expression set in that smug, self-satisfied way that had always made me uncomfortable. "Betty, we've decided that this arrangement isn't working anymore," she said, her voice taking on the tone someone might use to explain something to a slow child. "You living here with us just isn't sustainable. Living here with them, as if this was their house that they'd been graciously allowing me to stay in, rather than my house that I'd been generous enough to share with them when they'd fallen on hard times 2 years ago." "This is my house," I said quietly, my voice carrying a warning that neither of them seemed to notice. "My name is on the deed. I've lived here for 37 years. You don't get to decide that I can't live in my own home." Michael and Rachel exchanged a look that I didn't like at all. It was the kind of look that passes between people who've been planning something behind someone's back for a long time. "Actually, Mom," Michael said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that made my blood pressure spike, "we've been talking to some people, and legally speaking, there are ways to handle situations like this when elderly people aren't capable of making good decisions about their living arrangements anymore. Elderly people who aren't capable of making good decisions." My own son was standing in my driveway, watching strangers steal my belongings, and telling me that I wasn't capable of making decisions about my own life. "I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "And my decision is that I want these men to stop loading my belongings into their truck and leave my property immediately." But Rachel was already shaking her head, her smile growing wider and more condescending by the second. "Betty, that's exactly what we're talking about. You're not thinking clearly about this situation. Michael and I have children to think about. We need the space. We need the stability. We can't keep dealing with the complications that come with having an elderly person in the house. Complications. I was a complication that needed to be eliminated. What complications? I demanded. I pay my own bills. I take care of myself. I help with the household expenses. What complications are you talking about? Michael ran his hands through his hair in a gesture of frustration that I'd seen him use since he was a teenager. Mom, you don't understand how stressful it is having to worry about you all the time. The what-ifs, the potential problems, the liability issues. What if you fall and hurt yourself? What if you have a medical emergency? What if something happens and we're held responsible? Liability issues. My son was worried about the legal liability of having his mother live in her own house. But here's what Michael and Rachel didn't know about the liability issues they were creating for themselves. Here's what they couldn't see as they stood there in my driveway, stealing my belongings and threatening my security. They had no legal right to remove me from my home. They had no legal right to touch my belongings. They had no legal right to change my locks or alter my living situation in any way. What they were doing was called illegal eviction, theft, and elder abuse. And every second of it was being recorded by the security cameras I'd had installed around my property 6 months earlier. But I wasn't ready to reveal that information yet. First, I wanted to see exactly how far they were willing to go with their illegal activities. Michael, I said, keeping my voice calm and reasonable, I want you to tell these men to stop loading my belongings and leave my property. This is illegal, and you're going to find yourself in serious legal trouble if you continue. Michael looked at Rachel, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Then he turned back to me, with an expression that was equal parts pity and determination. Mom, we've already talked to a lawyer, he said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket. We have legal grounds to do this. You're not competent to live alone anymore, and we have a responsibility to make sure you're in a safe environment. He handed me the paper, and as I unfolded it, I realized that my son and his wife had been planning this betrayal for months. The document was a petition for guardianship, claiming that I was mentally incompetent and needed a court-appointed guardian to make decisions about my care and living arrangements. But here's where their plan revealed its fundamental flaw. Here's where their ignorance about my actual situation was about to become their biggest mistake. The petition listed Michael as the proposed guardian, and it detailed how he would responsibly manage his mother's limited assets and ensure her proper care in an appropriate facility. Limited assets. They thought I was financially dependent on them. They thought I needed their support to survive. They had no idea that the woman they were trying to have declared incompetent was actually the majority owner of Richardson Financial Holdings, a company that managed over $200 million in assets and employed more than 60 people across 3 states. They had no idea that their mentally incompetent mother was the CEO of the company that held the mortgages on over 3,000 homes in the tri-state area, including their own. They had no idea that the elderly woman with limited assets they were evicting was actually their landlord, their creditor, and their boss, all rolled into one very angry package. But they were about to find out. I stood in my driveway, holding the guardianship petition, and watching the movers continue to load my life into their truck, while Michael and Rachel waited for my response like they were expecting me to thank them for their initiative in destroying my autonomy. Michael, I said, refolding the legal document and looking directly into his eyes, do you understand what this paper represents? It represents us taking responsibility for your well-being, he said, his voice full of fake concern that made my stomach turn. Mom, we love you, but we can't keep pretending that you're capable of living independently. This house is too big for you. You're isolated here. You need professional care. Professional care. This from the son who hadn't visited me for more than an hour at a time in the past 6 months, who had never asked about my health, or my needs, or my preferences for my own life. And where exactly do you plan for me to live while you're stealing my house? I asked, my voice remaining calm despite the fury building inside me. Rachel stepped forward, pulling a brochure from her purse with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been planning this conversation for a long time. We found a lovely assisted living facility about 20 minutes from here, she said, handing me the glossy pamphlet. Sunset Manor. It's very nice, very affordable, and they have an opening available immediately. Very affordable. I looked at the brochure and saw exactly what they meant. Sunset Manor was the kind of place families put elderly relatives when they wanted them out of the way, but didn't want to spend much money, ensuring their comfort. It was a warehouse for people whose families had decided they were no longer worth the effort of caring for. You've already put me on a waiting list, I said, reading the paperwork clipped to the brochure. We've reserved a spot, Michael corrected, like there was a meaningful difference. We knew you'd probably resist this at first, so we wanted to make sure we had everything arranged so the transition could be as smooth as possible. Smooth for whom? I wondered. Certainly not smooth for the woman who was being forcibly removed from her home and institutionalized against her will. But here's what struck me most about this entire situation. Here's what revealed the true depth of their betrayal and their ignorance about who they were actually dealing with. They hadn't asked me about my finances. They hadn't asked me about my health. They hadn't asked me about my preferences, or my needs, or my desires for my own future. They'd simply decided that I was a problem that needed to be solved, and they'd gone ahead and solved it without my input or consent. Michael, I said, before you continue with this plan, there are some things about my situation that you should probably know. What things? He asked, his tone suggesting that he couldn't imagine what information I might have that would be relevant to their decision. Financial things, I said simply. Things about my assets and my income, and my ability to pay for my own care. Rachel laughed, actually laughed, at my words. Betty, we know you're worried about money, but that's exactly why this is the best solution. Sunset Manor accepts Medicare, and with the proceeds from selling this house, there should be enough to cover your care for several years. Proceeds from selling my house. They were planning to sell my home to pay for warehousing me in a facility I'd never chosen and didn't want to live in. You're going to sell my house, I repeated, wanting to make sure I understood the full scope of their theft. We're going to sell the house that you can't afford to maintain anymore, Michael corrected, and use the money to ensure that you get the care you need. And who decides that I can't afford to maintain my house? Mom, be realistic, Michael said, his patience clearly wearing thin. You're living on Social Security and Dad's pension. This house is expensive. The property taxes alone are more than $15,000 a year. The maintenance costs are astronomical. You can't keep pretending that you can afford to live here. Social Security and my father's pension. That's what they thought I was living on. That's how they'd calculated my limited assets and determined that I needed their financial management. And what makes you think you know anything about my financial situation? I asked. Rachel pulled out her phone and started scrolling through what looked like notes she'd prepared in advance. We've been keeping track, she said, her voice taking on the tone of someone presenting evidence in a court case. You shop at discount grocery stores. You use coupons. You drive a 10-year-old car. You haven't taken a vacation in years. You're clearly struggling financially. I shop at discount grocery stores because I believe in being responsible with money. I use coupons because I was raised to avoid waste. I drive a 10-year-old car because it's reliable and paid for. I haven't taken expensive vacations because I prefer to invest my money rather than spend it on temporary pleasure. But in Michael and Rachel's minds, these responsible financial choices were evidence of poverty and incompetence. You've been keeping track of my spending habits, I said, letting the implications of that statement sink in. We've been paying attention because we care about you, Michael said defensively. We've noticed that you're struggling, and we want to help. By stealing my house and institutionalizing me. By making sure you get the care and support you need in an environment that's appropriate for someone your age and situation. There it was again. Someone my age and situation. As if reaching 73 automatically disqualified me from making my own decisions about my own life. But here's what they didn't know about my age and situation. Here's what their careful observation of my spending habits had failed to uncover. The reason I shopped carefully and lived modestly wasn't because I couldn't afford to do otherwise. It was because I'd been taught that building wealth requires discipline and maintaining wealth requires continued discipline. I'd been living below my means for 40 years, not because I had to, but because I chose to. And that choice had resulted in a level of financial security that would have shocked them if they'd bothered to ask about it instead of simply assuming I was poor. Michael, I said, I think you should call off the movers and send them home. Mom, we've already paid for the truck and the storage unit. Everything is arranged. It's better if we just get this over with quickly. Storage unit? Rachel smiled like she was delivering good news. We've rented a storage unit for your belongings. The things that won't fit in your room at Sunset Manor can be stored there, and eventually we can sort through everything and decide what's worth keeping. Eventually they could sort through my belongings and decide what was worth keeping. They were planning to warehouse my possessions along with my person, and then dispose of whatever they deemed worthless. But there's something about being treated like a discarded piece of furniture that tends to bring out the fight in a person. There's something about watching your family steal your life that makes you want to remind them exactly who they're dealing with. Rachel, I said, my voice taking on a tone that neither of them had heard before. I want you to call your mortgage company and ask them who holds the deed to your house. What does that have to do with anything? She asked, confusion replacing her earlier confidence. Just humor me, I said. Call them right now and ask who owns your mortgage. Rachel looked at Michael, who shrugged like he couldn't see any harm in indulging my request. She dialed a number and waited for someone to answer. Yes, this is Rachel Martin, she said into the phone. I need to verify who holds the mortgage on my property at 847 Oak Street. Yes, I'll hold. While we waited, the movers continued loading my belongings into their truck. My grandmother's rocking chair. The dining room set Robert and I had bought for our first apartment. Boxes of photographs and documents, and mementos that represented 73 years of living. What? Rachel said suddenly, her voice sharp with surprise. Can you repeat that? Richardson Financial Holdings? Are you sure? Michael and Rachel both turned to look at me, and for the first time since I'd arrived home, I saw uncertainty in their eyes. Who is Richardson Financial Holdings? Michael asked. I smiled for the first time in what felt like hours. Why don't you ask them to connect you to CEO? I suggested to Rachel. Connect me to who? Rachel asked, still holding the phone. The CEO of Richardson Financial Holdings. I repeated. Tell them you'd like to speak to Betty Richardson. The silence that followed was absolute. The movers stopped working. Michael's mouth fell open. Rachel's face went white as she stared at me like I'd just revealed that I was actually an alien from another planet. You? Michael whispered. Me, I confirmed. And now I think it's time we had a very different conversation about who's going to be leaving this house. Rachel hung up the phone without speaking to anyone else, her hands shaking as she processed what she'd just learned. Michael was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. Mom, he said slowly, what is Richardson Financial Holdings? It's my company, I said simply. The company I founded with your father 35 years ago. The company I've been running since he died 8 years ago. The company that employs 63 people and manages over $200 million in assets. $200 million. I watched as that number sank into their minds and rearranged everything they thought they knew about me. But you live so simply, Rachel stammered. You drive an old car. You shop at discount stores. You don't have expensive things. I live simply because I choose to live simply, I explained. I drive an old car because it's reliable and economical. I shop at discount stores because I believe in being responsible with money. I don't have expensive things because I prefer to invest my money rather than spend it on status symbols. Michael was still staring at me in shock. Why didn't you tell us? Because I wanted to see who you really were when you thought I had nothing to offer you, I said, the truth of that statement hitting both of them like a physical blow. I wanted to know if your love for me was conditional on your perception of my usefulness. Mom, that's not fair, Michael protested. We do love you. This isn't about money, isn't it? I asked. Then why did you just try to steal my house? Why did you file a petition claiming I'm mentally incompetent? Why did you arrange to have me institutionalized without my consent? Because we thought you needed help, Rachel said, but her voice had lost all its earlier conviction. No, I corrected. You thought I was a burden you could dispose of without consequences. You thought I was a helpless old woman whose belongings you could steal and whose life you could rearrange to suit your convenience. But here's where the true scope of their miscalculation became apparent. Here's where they learned that their helpless old woman had more power than they could have imagined. Michael, I said, pulling my phone out of my purse. Do you remember when you and Rachel bought your house 2 years ago? Of course, he said, still looking dazed. Do you remember having trouble getting approved for a mortgage because of your credit history? Michael's face reddened slightly. We had some financial difficulties, but we worked them out. You worked them out because Richardson Financial Holdings approved your loan application when 3 other lenders had rejected it, I said. You got your mortgage because I personally overrode my company's standard credit requirements. The implications of that statement hit both of them at the same time. Not only did I own the company that held their mortgage, but I had personally arranged for them to get the loan that allowed them to buy their house. You approved our mortgage? Rachel asked weakly. I approved it, I structured it, and I've been monitoring it for 2 years, I confirmed. I know about every payment you've made, every time you've been late, every time you've had to scramble to cover your monthly obligation. How many times have we been late? Michael asked, though I could tell from his expression that he was afraid to hear the answer. 14 times in the past 18 months, I said, including last month when you were 12 days late because Rachel's car needed repairs and you had to choose between paying the mortgage and paying the mechanic. They'd been late with their mortgage payments 14 times, and they'd never wondered why their lender had been so patient with them. They'd never questioned why they hadn't faced penalties or late fees or threats of foreclosure. Why? Michael asked quietly. Why did you help us without telling us? Because you're my son, and I wanted you to succeed, I said. Because I thought that helping you build stability and security would make you happy, and your happiness was important to me. But you let us struggle, Rachel said, confusion and anger mixing in her voice. You watched us worry about money and stress about bills when you could have just given us whatever we needed. I watched you learn to be responsible adults, I corrected. I watched you figure out how to manage your finances and prioritize your spending and make the kind of decisions that build character. If I'd just given you money, you never would have learned those skills. But here's where their education about my true situation was about to take an even more shocking turn. Here's where they learned that their mortgage was just the beginning of their financial connection to me. Rachel, I said, what kind of car do you drive? A Honda Civic, she answered automatically, then looked confused about why I was asking. Where did you get the loan for that car? She thought for a moment. Some company called Central Auto Finance. They gave us a really good interest rate when the dealership financing fell through. Central Auto Finance is a subsidiary of Richardson Financial Holdings, I said. I approved that loan too. Michael sat down heavily on the porch steps. What else? Your credit cards, I said. The ones you use for emergencies and large purchases. They're issued through Gateway Financial Services. Another subsidiary? Michael asked weakly. Another subsidiary? I confirmed. I've been your creditor for virtually everything you own, Michael. Your house, your cars, your credit lines. All of it traces back to companies that I own and operate. Rachel was looking around like she was trapped in a nightmare. So when we were worrying about making payments, you were making payments to me, I finished. When you were stressed about your credit rating, you were worried about disappointing me. When you thought you were succeeding financially, you were succeeding because I was making it possible. But the most devastating revelation was still to come. The detail that would complete their understanding of exactly who they'd been trying to evict from her own home. There's one more thing you should know, I said, looking at both of them. About your house specifically. What about it? Michael asked, though his voice suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know. The reason you were able to get such a favorable mortgage rate, the reason your monthly payments are manageable, the reason you haven't faced any penalties for your late payments, I said, is because I structured your loan as a family assistance mortgage. What does that mean? Rachel asked. It means that for the past 2 years I've been subsidizing your mortgage payments, I explained. Your actual payment should be $2,847 per month, based on standard lending rates for your credit history. You've been paying $1,950 per month. I've been covering the difference. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear birds singing in the trees across the street. Michael and Rachel were both staring at me like I'd just told them the house was about to explode. How much? Michael whispered. How much what? How much have you been subsidizing our payments? I did the calculation quickly in my head. About $21,500 over the past 2 years. Rachel made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. You've been paying almost $1,000 a month toward our mortgage. I've been investing in my son's future, I said. I've been making sure that you could afford to live in a safe neighborhood and build equity and establish the kind of stability that I thought would make you happy. But we didn't know, Michael said, his voice barely audible. No, you didn't know, I agreed. You didn't know because I didn't want your gratitude to be conditional on your awareness of my help. I wanted to see if you could love me and respect me and treat me with dignity even when you thought I was just a poor old woman living on Social Security. And we failed that test, Rachel said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. You failed it spectacularly, I confirmed. But here's where the story could have ended with complete devastation and destroyed relationships. Here's where I could have used my power to destroy their lives as thoroughly as they'd tried to destroy mine. Instead, I was about to teach them a lesson about consequences that would change all of our lives forever. I looked at Michael and Rachel, both of whom seemed to be processing the reality that they'd just tried to evict the person who'd been secretly financing their entire lifestyle for 2 years. The movers had stopped working and were standing around looking confused, waiting for someone to tell them whether to continue loading the truck or start unloading it. Gentlemen, I called to the movers. I'm going to need you to stop what you're doing and wait for further instructions. The head mover, a tall man with graying hair, walked over to us. Ma'am, we've got a schedule to keep. Are we loading this truck or not? You're not loading anything else, I said firmly. In fact, you're going to unload everything you've already put in there and return it to the house. Now wait a minute, Rachel protested, some of her earlier aggressiveness returning. We've paid for this service. We have legal documents. You have fraudulent legal documents, I interrupted, pulling my own phone out and dialing a number I knew by heart. Documents that claim I'm mentally incompetent and financially dependent when I'm actually the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company. That's called fraud, Rachel, and fraud is a felony. Mom, please, Michael said, finally seeming to understand the magnitude of the situation they'd created. Can we talk about this? Can we work something out? Richard? I said into my phone, ignoring Michael's request. This is Betty Richardson. I need you to come to my house immediately with a police escort. My son and his wife have illegally removed my belongings from my home and are attempting to have me committed based on fraudulent claims of incompetence. Richard Morrison was my personal attorney, and he'd been handling my legal affairs for 15 years. He knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of, and he didn't ask unnecessary questions when I needed his help. Richard, I continued, please also bring the paperwork to immediately foreclose on 847 Oak Street. I'm calling in the loan. Rachel's face went white. You can't do that. I can absolutely do that, I said, ending my call and looking at her directly. Your mortgage agreement includes an acceleration clause that allows the lender to demand full payment if the borrower engages in illegal activities that affect the property. Illegal eviction and elder abuse qualify. Elder abuse? Michael repeated. What you've done today is textbook elder abuse, I explained. You've illegally removed an elderly Urser from her home, stolen her belongings, and attempted to have her institutionalized based on false claims. That's not just elder abuse. It's also kidnapping, theft, and fraud. But here's where I had to make a decision that would determine the future of my relationship with my son and his family. Here's where I had to choose between using my power to destroy them or using it to teach them. However, I continued, I'm willing to offer you an alternative to criminal prosecution and foreclosure. What kind of alternative? Michael asked, hope creeping into his voice. The kind that involves you learning some very important lessons about respect, honesty, and the consequences of your actions, I said. Are you interested in hearing my terms? Both of them nodded eagerly. First, I said, you're going to help the movers return every single item to exactly where it belongs in my house. Every piece of furniture, every box, every personal item, all of it goes back where you found it. Of course, Michael said quickly. Second, you're going to publicly apologize to me for your behavior today. Not just to me, but to anyone who witnessed this spectacle. You're going to acknowledge that you had no right to remove me from my home or touch my belongings. We'll apologize, Rachel said, though her voice was strained. Third, you're going to withdraw the guardianship petition and pay all the legal fees associated with filing fraudulent documents. How much will that cost? Michael asked nervously. Probably around $5,000, I said, which leads me to my fourth condition. I paused for a moment, watching their faces as they waited for what was coming next. Fourth, you're going to start paying your actual mortgage amount. No more subsidies from me. You're going to pay the full $28 and $47 per month that your loan agreement actually requires. Rachel started to protest, but I held up my hand to stop her. You wanted to be independent of me, I reminded her. You wanted to make your own decisions without my involvement. Well, now you get to find out what that actually looks like financially. We can't afford that much, Michael said, desperately. That's almost $900 more than we're paying now. Then you'll need to make some adjustments to your lifestyle, I said. Or you can sell your house and move somewhere more affordable. Those are your choices. What about our car loans? Rachel asked. What about our credit cards? Those will continue under their current terms as long as you make your payments on time, I said. But if you're late even once, I'll call in those loans too. But here's where I revealed the most important part of my plan. Here's where I showed them that consequences aren't always about punishment. There's a fifth condition, I said. What is it? Michael asked. You're going to spend time with me, I said. Real time, not obligation visits where you stay for an hour and leave. I want you to have dinner with me once a week. I want you to call me twice a week, just to talk. I want you to include me in family activities and treat me like someone whose company you actually enjoy. Mom, of course we enjoy your company, Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. No, you don't, I said honestly. You see me as an obligation, a burden, a problem to be managed. But I'm going to give you the opportunity to get to know me as a person, instead of seeing me as an inconvenience. And if we do all of this? Rachel asked. If we meet all your conditions? If you do all of this, and if you do it genuinely and consistently for 1 full year, I said, then I'll consider restructuring your mortgage back to the subsidized rate. I'll consider forgiving the legal fees. I'll consider treating this as a learning experience instead of a criminal matter. And if we don't? Michael asked. If you don't, then you'll discover exactly what it's like to live without the financial safety net you never knew you had, I said. You'll learn to succeed or fail based entirely on your own efforts, with no help from the woman you tried to throw away. But the most important lesson was still coming. The revelation that would teach them the true meaning of family and the real cost of taking people for granted. There's one more thing you should understand, I said, looking at both of them. This isn't about money. This isn't about power. This isn't even about revenge. What is it about? Rachel asked. It's about learning that the people you love aren't disposable, I said. It's about understanding that family relationships require respect and honesty and genuine care for each other's well-being. It's about discovering that the person you think is weighing you down might actually be the one holding you up. 20 minutes later, Richard arrived with 2 police officers who documented the situation and ensured that all of my belongings were returned to my house. The guardianship petition was officially withdrawn. The storage unit rental was canceled. The movers were paid and dismissed. Michael and Rachel spent the rest of the day putting my house back exactly the way it had been when I left to visit my sister 3 days earlier. They worked quietly, carefully, and I could see in their faces that they were beginning to understand the magnitude of what they'd almost lost. Not just the money, not just the house, not just the financial support, but the relationship with someone who had loved them enough to support them secretly for years without asking for anything in return. 3 weeks later, Michael and Rachel were sitting at my kitchen table for our first weekly dinner. The conversation was stilted and awkward, like we were strangers trying to figure out how to talk to each other. Which, in many ways, we were. "How was your week?" I asked, serving them the pot roast I'd made. The same recipe I'd been using for 40 years, the same meal I'd been making for Michael since he was a child. "Stressful," Michael admitted. "We're trying to figure out how to come up with the extra money for the mortgage payment." "What have you tried so far?" I asked, genuinely curious about how they were approaching the problem. "Rachel's been looking for a part-time job," he said, "and I've been considering asking for overtime at work. We've also been going through our budget to see what we can cut." This was the first time in years that Michael had talked to me about real problems with real solutions, instead of just complaining about circumstances beyond his control. It was the first time I'd seen him take ownership of his financial situation, instead of expecting someone else to solve his problems. "What did you find when you went through your budget?" I asked. Rachel looked embarrassed. "A lot of things we don't actually need," she said. "We were spending almost $400 a month on things like premium cable packages, subscription services we never used, and eating out 3 or 4 times a week. And what have you decided to do about those expenses?" "We canceled most of the subscriptions," Michael said. "We downgraded our cable package. We're working at home more often. It's actually been kind of nice, spending more time together as a family, instead of just grabbing fast food and watching different shows on different devices." I was surprised by the satisfaction I felt hearing this. Not because I was glad they were struggling, but because I was proud to see them taking responsibility and making smart decisions. "How much will those changes save you?" I asked. "About $350 a month," Rachel said. "We still need to find about 500 more, but we're getting there." "And how do you feel about making these changes?" Michael thought for a moment before answering. "Honestly, I feel better than I have in years. We were spending money on stuff that didn't make us happy anyway. Now we're being more intentional about everything." But here's what surprised me most about these weekly dinners. Here's what I hadn't expected when I'd made spending time with me one of their conditions. I was enjoying their company. For the first time in years, Michael and Rachel were talking to me like I was a real person, with opinions and experiences worth hearing. They were asking me questions about my business, my life, my perspectives on things. They were treating me like someone whose wisdom and knowledge might actually be valuable. "Mom," Michael said during our 4th weekly dinner, "can I ask you something about the business?" "Of course. How did you and Dad build Richardson Financial Holdings?" "I mean, I know Dad was good with money, but a multi-million-dollar company seems like something way beyond what I would have thought was possible." I smiled, remembering the early days when Robert and I had worked 18-hour days building something from nothing. "It started with your father's insurance business," I said. "He was very good at helping people plan for their futures, and he noticed that a lot of his clients needed better lending options than what the big banks were offering." "So, you started a lending company." "We started very small. Robert would identify clients who needed loans for legitimate purposes, but couldn't get approved through traditional channels. I would evaluate their situations and structure loans that made sense for both the borrowers and us." "You evaluated them?" Rachel asked, surprise in her voice. "I have a degree in accounting and finance," I said. "I worked in banking for 10 years before you were born, Michael. I wasn't just Dad's wife who happened to help with the business. I was his partner in every sense of the word." This was the first time I'd ever told them about my professional background. In all the years they'd known me, they'd never asked about my education, or my career, or my contributions to building the family's wealth. "Why didn't you ever tell us this?" Michael asked. "Because you never asked," I said simply. "You saw me as Mom and Grandmom, but never as Betty Richardson, the person who existed before you were born and continued to exist outside of my relationship to you. Tell us more, Rachel said, and for the first time since I'd known her, she seemed genuinely interested in hearing about my life. So I told them. I told them about starting the business in our basement, about the late nights spent reviewing loan applications and building client relationships. I told them about the risks we'd taken, the mistakes we'd made, the lessons we'd learned. I told them about how we'd grown from a two-person operation to a company that employed dozens of people and served thousands of clients. And after Dad died? Michael asked quietly. After Dad died, I had to decide whether to sell the business or run it myself, I said. I chose to run it myself because I realized that I was good at it, and because I wanted to honor what we'd built together. Were you scared? Rachel asked. Terrified, I admitted, but being scared doesn't disqualify you from doing something important. Being scared just means you have to be more careful and more prepared. But here's what I realized during these conversations. Here's what became clear as Michael and Rachel started seeing me as a complete person instead of just an elderly relative. They were discovering that I was actually interesting, that I had stories worth hearing and wisdom worth learning from, that I was someone they might actually want to spend time with, not just someone they felt obligated to visit. Mom, Michael said during our 6th weekly dinner, I owe you an apology that goes way beyond what happened with the moving truck. What do you mean? I mean, I've been treating you like you were irrelevant to my life, he said, his voice heavy with regret. I've been seeing you as this elderly person who needed to be managed instead of seeing you as someone I could learn from. And I've been doing the same thing, Rachel added. I've been so focused on what I thought you needed from us that I never considered what we might be able to learn from you. These admissions meant more to me than any amount of money or any level of financial success. These admissions meant that the people I loved were finally beginning to see me as a person worth knowing. What would you like to learn? I asked. Everything, Michael said. I want to know about your business. I want to understand how you make financial decisions. I want to hear about your life before I was born, and your life since Dad died, and your plans for the future. I want to know how you became so strong, Rachel added. How you learned to be so attentive and confident. How you built something meaningful instead of just getting by. So I taught them. Over the following months, our weekly dinners became masterclasses in business, finance, life planning, and personal development. I shared everything I'd learned about building wealth, managing risk, making difficult decisions, and recovering from setbacks. But more importantly, I shared who I was as a person. My hopes, my fears, my dreams, my disappointments, my perspectives on relationships, family, success, and what makes life meaningful. And they shared themselves with me too. Not just their problems and their struggles, but their goals and their dreams and their ideas about the future. 6 months after the moving truck incident, Michael and Rachel had not only met all of my conditions, they had exceeded them. They were not just spending time with me, they were building a genuine relationship with me. They weren't just making their mortgage payments, they were thriving financially by applying the principles I'd taught them. Mom, Michael said during one of our weekly dinners, Rachel and I have been talking, and we have something we want to ask you. What is it? We want to know if you'd be willing to teach us more about the business, Rachel said. Not just the financial principles, but the actual operations. We want to understand how Richardson Financial Holdings works. Why? I asked, though I thought I knew the answer. Because we want to be part of it, Michael said. We want to contribute to what you and Dad built, instead of just benefiting from it. This was something I dreamed about for years but had never dared to hope for. The idea that my son might want to join the family business, that he might want to carry on what Robert and I had created together. What makes you think you'd be good at it? I asked. Honestly, we don't know if we would be, Rachel admitted, but we know we want to try. We know we want to learn from you while we still can, while they still could. That phrase carried weight that none of us wanted to acknowledge directly. I was 73 years old, and while I was healthy and sharp, we all knew that I wouldn't be around forever. If you're serious about this, I said, then we need to do it properly. You'd need to start at entry-level positions and work your way up. You'd need to learn every aspect of the business from the ground up. You'd need to prove yourselves to our employees and our clients, not just to me. We understand, Michael said. We don't want special treatment just because we're family. We want to earn our place in the company. And what about your current jobs? We've talked about that too, Rachel said. We think we can transition gradually. Maybe start part-time with Richardson Financial while we finish up our commitments at our current jobs. But here's what moved me most about this conversation. Here's what told me that the lessons they'd learned over the past 6 months were real and lasting. There's something else, Michael said. We want to pay you back. Pay me back for what? For everything, Rachel said. The mortgage subsidies, the legal fees, all the help you've given us over the years without us knowing it. We want to pay it all back with interest. You don't need to do that, I said. Yes, we do, Michael insisted. Not because you're demanding it, but because we want. We want to start our relationship with you from a clean slate. We want to know that anything you give us going forward is a gift, not something we're taking because we haven't learned to stand on our own. This was the moment when I knew that the transformation was complete. This was when I understood that the people who had tried to throw me away 6 months earlier had become people I was proud to call family. All right, I said, if you're serious about this, then let's discuss the terms. Over the next hour, we worked out a plan. Michael and Rachel would start working part-time for Richardson Financial Holdings, learning the business from the bottom up. They would pay back the financial assistance I'd provided over the years, not because I needed the money, but because they needed the integrity of earning their way. Most importantly, they would continue our weekly dinners indefinitely, not as a condition of forgiveness, but as a family tradition that we all valued. There's one more thing, I said as we finished our planning. About my will. Both of them looked uncomfortable. Mom, you don't need to. Yes, I do, I interrupted. Because the will I wrote 6 months ago doesn't reflect who you've become or what our relationship has become. I pulled out a document that I'd had prepared the week before. This is my new will. It leaves the majority of my estate to both of you, with the understanding that you'll use it to continue building Richardson Financial Holdings and serving our clients. Mom, Rachel said, tears forming in her eyes, we don't deserve this. You deserve it because you've earned it, I said. Not by being related to me, but by proving that you understand the responsibility that comes with wealth and power. What responsibility? Michael asked. The responsibility to use what you have to lift other people up instead of putting them down, I said. The responsibility to see people as human beings with dignity and worth, regardless of their age or their circumstances or their usefulness to you. Like you did for us, Rachel said quietly. Like I did for you. I agreed, and like you'll do for others when your time came to carry this forward. But the most important lesson was still to come, the final understanding that would complete their education about family, respect, and the true meaning of wealth. Do you understand now why I live simply? I asked them. Why I drive an old car and shop at discount stores, and don't flaunt my wealth? Because you wanted to see who we really were, Michael said. Partly, I agreed. But also because I wanted to remember who I really am. Wealth can insulate you from reality if you let it. It can make you forget that your worth as a person isn't determined by your bank account, and it can make you forget that other people have worth too. Rachel added, understanding dawning in her voice. Exactly. The moment you start thinking that your money makes you better than other people, or that other people's lack of money makes them less valuable, you've lost something essential about your humanity. I looked at both of them, these people who had thrown my belongings into the street 6 months earlier and were now planning to dedicate their lives to continuing my work. The real wealth, I said, isn't in the bank accounts or the properties or the business assets. The real wealth is in the relationships we build, the people we lift up, and the legacy we leave behind. What legacy do you want to leave behind? Michael asked. I want to leave behind a family that understands the difference between having power and using power wisely, I said. I want to leave behind a business that serves people instead of exploiting them. I want to leave behind the knowledge that the people I loved learned to see themselves and others as having value that goes far beyond their financial worth. And what do you want us to remember about today, about this whole experience? Rachel asked. I thought about that question for a long moment, remembering the moving truck in my driveway and the look of contempt on their faces when they thought I was just a burden to be disposed of. I want you to remember that the people you think are weighing you down might actually be the ones holding you up, I said. I want you to remember that throwing someone away is the surest way to discover how much you needed them all along. And I want you to remember that family isn't about blood or obligation, or even love, I continued. Family is about choosing to see each other as valuable, choosing to support each other's growth, and choosing to build something together that's stronger than any of us could build alone. That night, after Michael and Rachel had gone home to their house, the house they were now paying for entirely on their own, I sat in my living room surrounded by all the belongings they'd tried to throw away 6 months earlier. My mother's china, my grandmother's rocking chair, 40 years of photographs and memories and mementos that represented a life well lived. But the most valuable thing in that room wasn't any object or possession. The most valuable thing was the knowledge that the people I loved had learned to see me and themselves as more than just the sum of their assets or their usefulness to others. And that, my dear listeners, is how a family that tried to throw me away learned that some things are too valuable to be discarded. If my story has taught you anything, let it be this. Never assume that the people in your life are disposable just because they seem inconvenient or demanding or different from who they used to be. Never try to throw someone away without first making sure you understand exactly what you're losing, because sometimes the people who seem like the biggest burden are actually carrying the most weight, and sometimes the ones you think you can live without are the ones who've been making your life possible all along. The next time you're tempted to discard someone because they're not useful to you anymore, remember that usefulness and value are not the same thing. Remember that the people who love you enough to support you quietly, without recognition or credit, are the ones most worth keeping in your life. I have more stories to share about family, respect, and the surprising ways that people can change when they're given the chance to see themselves and others clearly. So subscribe, share your thoughts, and remember, before you throw someone away, make sure you know exactly what you're losing, because sometimes the most valuable things in our lives are the ones we take for granted until they're gone.